Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss the industrialization of migration across the southern border of the United States. But first, I recently spoke with Niccolò Armandola of the University of Zurich about his recent paper titled Rebel Without a Cause: The Effects of Social Origins and Disposable Income on Rule Violations. The paper is to be published in the European Sociological Review and is co-authored by Alexander Ehlert and Heiko Rauhut.
Mr. Armandola, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So your paper asks, one of the questions it asks is essentially who violates the rules? And, there's the children of affluence or their peers. That's one way, one element. And another is the wealthy or the not so wealthy. Who's more likely to violate rules? So I want to start off by asking what motivates this question? What leads you to ask this question?
Thank you for this question. It's very interesting because in this occasion, I was reading a paper, an experimental paper, which tried to replicate the effects that were found in a European sample, in which the less wealthy participants violated the rules more often, but they replicated it in Africa with a local tribe. And in this tribe, they could find, they had situations of extreme poverty when the crops were of a low level, and they couldn't replicate the findings. So I dug a bit deeper and found that there were some studies that were dealing with populations from Africa or rural populations also in Asia, and they couldn't replicate this finding of the Western societies. So I was wondering, what is it that are we not grasping in Europe or in America, where we try to do these experiments with mostly with students? So is there something that we're missing out? And this motivated to study it with a sample that we got our hands on in Switzerland.
So why might one hypothesize that, poorer people are more likely to violate the rules? I mean, what's the thinking behind the claim that people who are less well off are going to be more likely to break the rules or?
Well, I believe that these theories are kind of a classic of sociological research, but also economists. They have pointed out that there is a certain resource scarcity when you are from a lower social class or a situation of poverty. So given that you have this resource scarcity, so you have no means to fulfill the societal goals that society expects from us, you have to kind of shift your moral standards. And this kind of increases the predisposition of to rule violations. So it's kind of a lack of alternatives that leads people from less privileged backgrounds to violate rules. So this is kind of the traditional way of thinking. And what I found when I was doing the first literature research about this topic is that this assumption has been challenged in the past, especially from psychologists that have found out that being raised in high social classes has also some psychological side effects, I call them. For example, people develop some kind of values that are different from the values that society wants us to have. For example, they feel a greater power, sometimes even greed, and also they develop self-centered values. And this kind of the assumption of psychologists is that this kind of deals gets them to have develop the feeling they can live above the rules. So this was this challenge to the traditional economic way that led me to start the analysis, that led us, me and my co-authors, to start the analysis.
So what's about the idea that there are these rules that exist, but there are also often, not always, but often there are consequences for getting caught, actually. Those don't, does anything in the literature say about whether those make a difference, whether people, who have more, because one argument would be people who have more to lose are less likely to violate So, but I don't know, is that in the literature at all, or is this just, maybe there's a good reason it's not, if it's not in the literature, maybe there's a good reason it's not in the literature. It's already been studied and rejected. That's years ago.
No, it's a very interesting point. It is in the literature because what you say, it's kind of the logical expectation. So if there is punishment for rule breaking, then people that have much to lose, they kind of tend to refrain from breaking the rules. But actually what psychological studies have found out, and I refer especially to a paper which was an experimental paper done in the year 2000, that some fines, if they're too low, they may even be perceived as prices from people that can afford them. And in this particular experiment, it was like a nursery for children, and they noticed that people were always picking up their kids late. So they introduced a fine to refrain people from being late and to picking up people late. But this fine was so low that certain families, they agreed to pay the fine because it was like the price to pay for a certain, for the care, the 5 minutes more care that they had for their children, or 10 minutes even. And I found this mechanism very interesting because it's a punishment which goes on to actually increase rule breaking instead of preventing it.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So if I get this straight, just to make sure I'm understanding. So the argument that people who are less well off are more likely to violate the rules is that they are, they don't have an access to fulfill societal expectations without violating the rules, because of resource scarcity. So they violate the rules to do that. But the other argument is that, well, wealthier people are more likely to violate the rules because they get psychologically socialized to expect to float above the rules, to exist above the rules, and to violate the rules because of maybe perhaps greed or selfishness or self-centeredness. Some of the terrain is the theoretical terrain is talking about those two different ways of thinking of it.
That's exactly right. This is at least the second one is the psychological view of things. So that if you've been socialized a certain way, maybe come from a wealthy background, then you can afford to do some stuff that other people cannot afford because, for example, your parents can pay the fine, or because you do not need to fear the consequences of your actions.
So in order to address this question, you need to know whether rules were violated. So how did you get that information? I mean, it doesn't seem like, the whole logic of violating a rule is you don't usually, well, I guess it's possible that someone runs down the middle of the street shouting to, I just cheated on my taxes, but it's not the common approach. So how did you get information that allow you to address this question?
Exactly. So there are two means of getting this information. The first one, the obvious one, is to ask a question and hope that the participants of your survey are straight to you and are direct to you and say that I've broken rules in the past, or I'm breaking rules right now. This is problematic because, of course, when you are asking people, then there is a certain social desirability bias. So it is rare that people say actually the truth to something that they know they shouldn't be doing. So what we came up with was an experiment. We set up an experiment which allowed us to observe people if people were being honest or not. And this was kind of what can be seen as a fun game. They had a normal dice, like the dice you use to play Monopoly, and they had to roll these dice, and the amount of numbers that were the number that was shown by the dice was equal to the payment they would get from the experiment. So the higher the dice roll, the higher the payment. Okay. Now, the participants were the only ones to see which number they rolled. So the experimenter could not tell, okay, person A, I saw him, he rolled a 1, but he wrote that he rolled a 6 in order to have 6 francs, our dollars, $6 instead of $1. we didn't want to do that because we didn't want to that the participants felt they were observed. So they were set in cubicles where nobody could observe what they actually rolled. So it was up to them to write down the number they rolled. And now we can ask, how can you actually be sure that somebody lied on or was honest? We cannot. So on the individual level, we cannot know if person A or person B were honest. But what we can know is on the aggregate level, because our dice was a fair dice. And so if we have a big enough sample, we should expect a uniform distribution of the dice game outcomes. And what we observed is that some people lied because on the aggregate level, we didn't get this uniform distribution.
So a uniform distribution meaning
1/6 for every number.
Okay, so if you have 6 numbers and you have 100 people, about 16 or 17 of them will be roll a 1, 16 or 17 will roll a 2.
Exactly. So that was the idea. That would be the ideal outcome if everybody was honest.
Right, but you didn't get that.
No, we didn't get that. Exactly. We got, of course, as expected, that a higher proportion of people rolling higher numbers than lower numbers, because the higher numbers were the numbers that got higher payoffs.
Right. So that tells you that there was probably cheating going on. But then so what did you find with respect to this question of who is more likely to violate a rule?
And that is our striking result, because we didn't expect it to be this big. Because what we found out was that with increasing disposable income, that means with increasing financial resources at disposal, which we measured as the actual money that the people would make, then people socialized in higher class, they would steal more or cheat more than people socialized in lower social classes, which was very surprising to us.
So let me just make sure I understand. So the person who grew up in a well-off family, who then has a higher earnings or higher income, is more likely to cheat than the person who grew up in a poorer family but ended up with the same amount of income.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So what do you make of this finding? It is surprising.
Because we were so surprised by this result, we tried to make some post-hoc analysis and try to understand what could be the factors leading to this striking difference in behavior in our experiment. And I didn't mention our data earlier, which is quite important because it was a longitudinal study in which participants were followed by interviewers for 14 years. And this experiment was played in the last wave, so when the participants were young adults. And what we could actually measure, because we had such a big data frame, we found out that we had some measures that were measuring the values and the legitimacy of some moral, let me put it this way, the legitimacy of rule violations. So what I was telling you before, that people have this feeling that they can live above the rules. There was a battery of questions that went in the direction, it's okay to cheat if you gain money out of it, or if it's okay to cheat if you do not get caught, and so on. So we tried to use these questions to see if there was a similar pattern to our results in the experiment, and that was what we found. So the participants, as you put it before, the participants that earned a lot of money and came from a wealthy background, they were the ones that were more tolerant of rule violations. So I labeled it in the paper as morally flexible. So they were people that were more morally flexible. While the people that had the same amount of money but were socialized in a lower socioeconomic background, they would cheat less. in the game, and they would also have a propensity to recognize that rule violations are also wrong. So they believe that rule violating behavior is not legitimate.
So they're the morally, I don't know, rigid sounds like a negative term. We tend to like, well, some countries tend to like flexibility. Morally, there's got to be we've got to come up with a term that's equivalent to morally flexible. But I guess on the other hand, you need to explain or characterize, because the norm, the expectation would be the first, the morally, the people who are saying that no, you can't violate the rules, it's not okay, right? So so I guess the question is, you know, do your findings say anything about, I mean, not, you know, do you have a statistical model to address it, but as you look at your findings, do you have, what would you say about the function and prospects of societies with people with these diverse understandings engaged in basically the, you know, in the same context? They're living in the same society together. What conditions might be challenging or easier under those conditions where you have people with different frameworks approaching, you know, engaging the same, you know, basically working together or not working, you know, in the same context, sometimes needing to work together, perhaps?
So, how can I answer that question properly? Could you rephrase the question, because I'm not sure that I understood it correctly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's not a well-formed question. I think
no, I didn't want to imply that, but
well,
I'm not sure if I could follow your entire.
I'm just trying to figure out. You have people who are born in wealth and people who are born not in wealth, maybe in poverty, but maybe in the middle. And then they end up in the same institutions, some of them, where they are earning the same amount of money. But they're coming at it with entirely different frameworks. What is this, you know, does this throw up any challenges, or is this actually a resource for a business, for example? I'm just, you know, I'm not expecting you to, or, you know, asking you to say, I know it's this way, but if you thinking about your findings, what kinds of things are you sensitized to wonder about or to hypothesize? It might be working like this, or it might be working like that. So it's still not a well-formed question, but I'm just trying to figure out what are the downstream implications of this? What are some we might consider or think about or investigate or wonder, maybe that's true, and maybe do research on, or as we move into our lives, think about, oh, maybe this is what's going on.
Well, now I understand the question. I would believe that it creates more of a challenge than a resource for business. For example, if somebody with a certain background and thus a different kind of value has to work together with a person that has another upbringing, let's say a higher social upbringing, and someone that has the feeling of being able to live above the rules, then I would imagine that would generate a friction between the two of them, because then you create this inequality that we also see in everyday life, of people being better off and of people being on the other side of the social ladder. I would suggest that one implication of our study is that it suggests that we should maybe stop stigmatizing lower class individuals, because these correlations that we have assumed for so long, since the 70s, but also before that, lower class individuals might be more dishonest. These correlations, they seem to be spurious. So there might be some wrong stereotypes here, which is a big problem in our days society.
Well, that's a big downstream implication. It's interesting, though, you know, you're thinking about it as a challenge, and it makes sense that the two people or the set of people working together, that might generate some friction. In the US context, corporations are people. So the law recognizes them as people, so they can't vote, but they can, apply, make contributions to political campaigns, lobby, and so forth. And so I'm wondering, we've got these individuals who have a history, growing up in poverty or wealth, and then behaving differently. But I can imagine a corporation that wants to be firmly on the keep the rules, don't violate them side. It's going to want people who are going to do that. But the organizations that want to be very close to the line, and maybe they go over sometimes, but they might want to recruit the other kind. So you might end up with this sort of, it's not clear. You can't easily go into an interview and say, hey, are you going to cheat? And the person says, no. Okay, well, we don't want you. Or are you going to cheat? Well, I've cheated in the past. Well, come on in. It's not like you can do a very clear screen at the outset, but companies have cultures, businesses have cultures, and maybe one kind of culture fosters one approach of keeping rules, and the other fosters playing fast and loose, and maybe it works right in with this idea of people entering with different understandings of what this, flexibility or non-flexibility. It's a rich paper. I'm just thinking that there are a lot of different pathways it can work through.
What I was thinking is that it seems to what we showed in with our, especially with our postdoc analysis about these values, different distribution of values, dependent and conditional upon the socialization of the young adults. It seems that being socialized in higher social classes has some side effects. So maybe it could be that one possible intervention is that schools, for example, but also businesses, they try to foster some value building, some value branding into the values that are good for society, that are accepted by society. So yes, that would be one possible way of dampening this difference between the behaviors showed in the experiment.
Yes, well, it sounds like there's, yes?
Oh, thank you. It makes me wonder what could be such intervention, because as we have seen in this other paper that I mentioned, which I read back then, but then when I was writing my thesis as well, is what kind of punishment, because not all punishments are effective, as we've seen with the example of the monetary fine. So some punishments are maybe too high, some punishments are maybe too low. So how can we kind of try to diffuse or foster these values that society wants us to implement?
Well, Mr. Armandola, it's a rich analysis and opens to all sorts of possibilities, but it's this finding that you said, the implication of we should not stigmatize people who are disadvantaged under the sort of this expectation that they are going to be dishonest. And in fact, your findings go exactly, the other way. It's a real sensitizing finding, something to really to take in and take, because I think a lot of that stigmatization can actually be, some of it's conscious, but some of it might just be unconscious, just like, just dismissing people or doubting them because of where they come from. So that's an important, even if no further work is done, I think that's an important intervention in society and in our understanding. And I appreciate your doing this work. It sounds like it's very difficult and doing it well enough to give us some solid findings. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you sharing it with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Our final segment concerns the industrialization of migration across the southern border of the United States. The July 1 Wall Street Journal article headline read, "Smuggling Migrants to the U.S. is Big Business." The article noted that basically, smuggling people across the border has become an industrial enterprise. In the past, it was a cottage industry. Basically, small, rural, neighborhood-based entrepreneurs basically ran the business. But more recently, it's becoming the province of drug cartels that control the routes of passage northward. Sociologically, drug cartels are well positioned to take over moving people from one country illegally to another. They have the hard infrastructure as well as the human and social capital to maximize profits in this space. The hard infrastructure consists of things like tunnels, trucks, and weapons that can facilitate the process. They also have the human capital. They have the knowledge of the routes, and they know the tactics of border control better, which enables them to better evade the border police. They also have the social capital, which is relationships with subcontractors as well as with officials who are on the take. So one would be hard-pressed to think of another organization better positioned to industrialize illegal immigration. The Wall Street Journal article also noted that coyotes, or guides, tended to move groups of 5 migrants or fewer through the terrain. And in that model, they would need to pay tolls to continue along their way. So that would consist basically of protection money as well as bribes to officials. Once in the United States, migrants who do not plan to ask for asylum, according to the article, would be loaded onto trucks for transport to disparate locations. Because of more militarization of the border, as well as increasing demand, costs have risen from $4,000 per person to over $13,000 per person. One response to this increasing cost is the construction of caravans. The Wall Street Journal article noted that migrants without the money to pay coyotes, or these guides, would group into caravans. The large number of people in the caravan, the thinking goes, would make them safe from gangs, and it would also help them evade capture and extortion from security officials. One problem with the caravans, of course, is that they receive a lot of attention. They receive a lot of media attention, and they receive a lot of political attention. It's kind of a chicken and egg question. Do the caravans receive media attention and that leads to the political attention, or do they receive political attention and that leads to the media attention? Be that as it may, the caravans are also something that's unwanted by the drug cartels. One coyote reported that, according to the article, quote, "Caravans are a problem because they make it harder for us to move people." So basically they're getting attention, and that attention leads to even greater militarization, greater sets of resources deployed to hinder movement of people across borders. Now, sociologically, what that means is that the numbers of people that the caravan seeks, the caravan organizers would try to get as many people as possible to create safety and to lower costs. That very strategy leads to more media and political attention, so they become targets of the media and politics. But what this means is that politically, the more you reduce caravans, the greater you strengthen drug cartels. You're helping the drug cartels gain a monopoly. You're making more people dependent on the drug cartels for migration services, and you therefore facilitate the cartels raising their prices and thus raising their profits. Because the visibility of caravans makes the movement of people outside the caravan harder. So you have this caravan who's getting a lot of media attention. If that increases the intensity of policing the border, it hinders the movement of people who aren't even connected to the caravan. That political visibility might motivate or exacerbate drug cartel violence toward the caravans. So this basically is sort of a negative symbiotic relationship. Now, the visibility itself is partly a result of immigration politics in the United States. It's not clear whether immigration to the U.S. is increased or decreased by caravans. Now, most obvious, simplistic, and perhaps correct view would be to say that, well, caravans increase the immigration to the U.S. because it's just more people coming over the border over and above those entering by other means. Alternatively, however, it could decrease the incidence of immigration by enhancing the seasonal aspect of migration, therefore concentrating people in one period of time. But what that means is that, since people aren't traveling at other times, there's a limited capacity of caravans anyway, and even though it may be large, it's not infinite, and therefore you ending up with, if you have caravans, you ending up decreasing the flow. Both of these are possibilities. As far as I know, there's no clear answer to which it is. What we do know is that regardless of whether it's increasing or decreasing the incidence of migration, the visibility in the United States is not about effective policy, it's about strategic politics. And the reason I say that is that if it were about effective policy, there would be studies being funded to evaluate this, but that's not what's happening. It's really basically a talking point. So what this means, of course, when we look at the experience of immigrants is that, or would-be immigrants, is that they're caught between an exploitive immigration industry that's industrializing on the one hand, corrupt security personnel on the other, and of course there are more than two hands, political posturing in the United States that's further exacerbating their situation, and whatever push factors are motivating people to uproot their families and head north in the first place, which could be environmental issues, could be issues of violence. Those may or may not trace back to U.S. policy. So when we look at this, the increasing industrialization of migration services to get people from one country to another illegally, what we find is another example of how the complexity of the issue of immigration is playing out. The complexity makes it likely that when you pursue one policy aim, you often undermine another. In this case, as you weaken or eliminate caravans or focus your attention on them, you end up raising the profits and market share and monopolization opportunities of the drug cartels. If you're interested in both, in undermining the drug cartels and in controlling immigration, giving more and more attention to the caravans is working against both of your aims. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.